From Washington, D.C., this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Hena Zuberi. Our top story tonight is about Los Angeles urging the public to mask up to avoid the Delta virus as July 4th approaches. Los Angeles County public health authorities are urging unvaccinated and vaccinated people alike to wear masks indoors. Restaurants, stores, and other public indoor spaces are where COVID's more contagious Delta variant poses a growing threat. The county has just dropped the mask requirement on June 15th. The World Health Organization recently announced that people should wear masks indoor in public settings, again, even if they're vaccinated. Officials are concerned about the fast-spreading Delta virus, which devastated India. In Arkansas, Governor Asa Hutchinson said more than 90% of the active virus cases were unvaccinated. Since January, over 99% of deaths in Arkansas were of people who were not vaccinated. In the same time period, more than 98% of those hospitalized with COVID-19 were also not vaccinated. The Guardian reports that extremist rhetoric from right-wing news networks and some elected Republicans is intensifying. Right-wing Fox News TV personality Tucker Carlson on his June 24th show raged that the United States could become Rwanda. He was referring to the 1994 genocide between Hutus and Tutsis in the country. Hundreds and thousands of Tutsis were slaughtered in that genocide. A day before, far-right One American News Network's reporter Pearson Sharp called for the execution of those falsely accused of stealing the 2020 election. That network is carried by television service providers AT&T and Verizon. Anti-camping laws targeting the homeless were suspended during the COVID-19 pandemic in Los Angeles. Now they're coming back. The LA City Council voted 13-2 in favor of adopting a new city ordinance banning homeless encampments on Thursday. The ordinance will be tabled until July 28th, when another vote will take place. Dozens of tents have been popping up at Los Angeles' iconic Echo Park since the start of the pandemic. City officials announced they will soon clear the area. This means homeless people will have to find another place to stay. Here is Ayman Ahmed, a camp resident and a member of Echo Park Rise Up organization.
If you kick us out of here, it's not like we're not outside anymore. We're still live outside. We're homeless. So if you get us out of the park, we're just going to have to find someplace new to sleep outside. But the issue is they made all of outside illegal. So wherever we go, we're going to be harassed and told to leave.
Let us hear now from Scott. Scott is no longer unhoused. He's living in Venice House with other formerly homeless people.
It's a rarity to find a place that's affordable, that's focused on, I guess, good things, like recovery and that sort of thing.
We'll have a special report on homelessness later on tonight's program. Indigenous leaders and climate change activists blockaded access to the White House on Wednesday. They were calling on President Joe Biden to invest more in climate justice initiatives in his infrastructure plans. They asked to stop fossil fuel projects, including the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline and the Mountain Valley pipeline. Many American businesses have received millions in federal pandemic aid, and they exploited loopholes to lay off employees anyways. A ProPublica investigation reveals that Freight Car America near Muscle Shoals, Alabama, did exactly that. It received $10 million of PPP loans, the maximum amount available under a pandemic relief program designed to keep workers employed. But then it told employees that the plant was closing for good. All production moved to the company's new facility in Mexico. Some employees believed that the funds would keep the doors open for a little while longer. Most of the assembly workers would lose their jobs. Freight Car America isn't the only large company to have done this. ProPublica's analysis revealed that at least half a dozen companies did the same. They terminated over 50 workers in 2020 after their aid was approved. Justice Elena Kagan ripped her conservative colleagues apart in the Supreme Court on Thursday in a blistering 41-page dissent. She accused them of ignoring the legislative intent of the 1965 Voting Rights Act as well as the High Court's own precedents. Kagan's dissenting opinion was joined by two other liberal members of the court, Justices Stephen Breyer and Sonia Sotomayor. She accused her conservative colleagues of undermining Section 2 of the landmark Voting Rights Act. She wrote that part of the law is a statuette that stands in a monument to America's greatness. Kagan also said no other statuette has done more to advance the nation's highest ideals, yet the court has treated no statuette worse in the last decade. We have an analysis of the Supreme Court decision later on in the show. In international news, we begin with the news of a vaccine called Abdullah. Cuba has announced that its Abdullah vaccine is over 92% effective against COVID-19 after 3 doses. This is on par with the Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna jabs. The Abdullah vaccine was developed by Cuba's Center for Genetic Engineering. It is one of the 5 vaccine candidates being trialed on the island. Cuba's health authorities aim to have 100% of the island's inhabitants vaccinated by the end of the year. Cuba has more than 30 years of experience in producing vaccines. The country's hepatitis B and meningitis vaccines are widely used in Latin America and other countries. The vaccine Abdullah is named after a poem by the Cuban leader José Martí. Abdullah is a common Muslim name meaning servant of God. President Xi Jinping praised the progress China has made during the celebrations for the Chinese Communist Party on Tuesday. He hailed China's irreversible course from the colonial humiliation to great power status. Xi Jinping said that the era of China being bullied is gone forever. He spoke above a giant portrait of Mao Zedong, which dominates Tiananmen Square. He also stood at the same podium where Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China in 1949. Xi Jinping said that the party had brought about national rejuvenation, lifting tens and millions of people from poverty and altered the landscape of world development. Here is President Xi Jinping addressing the rally.
中国人民从来没有欺
We
负、
have never bullied,
压迫、
oppressed,
奴役过其他国
or
家人民。
subjugated the people of any other country.
过去没有。中国人
By
民
the same
也
token,
绝不允
we
许
will
任
never
何外来
allow
势
any
力
foreign
欺
force
负、
to bully,
压迫、
oppress,
奴役我
or
们。
subjugate
谁妄想
In the past, Xi Jinping has purged rivals from the Communist Party and has crushed pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. He's also led the establishment of the largest concentration camp since the Nazis, where Uyghurs are detained and abused. The sister of a British MP murdered by a pro-Brexit extremist in 2016 has been elected in a key UK by-election. Kim Leadbeater is the sister of British lawmaker Joe Cox, who was murdered by a far-right extremist. This election was seen as a make-or-break moment for the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. The seat was previously held by Leadbeater's sister, Cox. Cox was a pro-EU lawmaker and was seen as a rising star in the Labour Party. She was shot and stabbed multiple times by a gunman who shouted "Britain first" in an assassination that stunned the country. Leadbeater said that she suffered abuse during the campaign. Her team members were abused in the streets and had things thrown on them on multiple occasions. 6 decades after she went through training to become one of the first women in space, Wally Funk has finally gotten her chance to hit zero gravity. The trip is 60 years overdue for Funk. The 82-year-old was the first woman trained to fly into space from 1960 to 1961. However, she was excluded from the trip because of her gender. Jeff Bezos has invited her as a guest on the first crewed flight of his rocket maker, Blue Origin. The trip on the New Shepard spacecraft is scheduled for July 20th. On his Instagram, Bezos said of Funk, "No one has waited longer. It's time. Welcome to the crew, Wally." Here is the happy Funk.
We're going to fly you up into space on the very first flight. That's your
I can't tell people that are watching how fabulous I feel to have been picked by Blue Origin to go on this trip.
You're going to be an astronaut.
Oh, finally! And I'll love every second of it. Woo! Ha ha! I can hardly wait.
In related news, Jeff Bezos may not be the first billionaire in space. Virgin Galactic's Richard Branson is set to get his long-awaited trip to space as early as July 11th. This would allow him to beat Blue Origin's Jeff Bezos, who's scheduled to fly on his company's spacecraft 9 days later. As the pandemic is winding down, cities are hardening their attitude towards the homeless. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
America became nice to the homeless during the pandemic. People were generous, and generosity grew in 2020. Cities were placing the homeless in hotels. But now masks are off. Life is almost back to normal, and once again, the homeless are considered a problem. New York City is removing homeless people from the hotels where the city placed them in during the pandemic. Los Angeles was also nice just a while ago. There was even an amazing community fridge movement. Clean refrigerators packed with food were set up on the sidewalks of LA. This wasn't a government program. People did this for their homeless neighbors. These community fridges were a hit. They're overflowing with fresh greens and boxes of to-go meals donated by community members. People even placed face masks, diapers, and hand sanitizers next to the community fridge. All were free for the homeless. Los Angeles even suspended its anti-camping laws during the pandemic.
When COVID first started, they almost in a sense, allowed us to be out here and didn't really push anything, As time went by, then it became an issue, and then now they started putting all these rules and telling us that we can't be here or there.
Now laws against homeless camping are coming back. Where should the homeless go? Here is Ayman Ahmed, a camp resident and Echo Park Rise Up organization member.
Tax dollars go to the government, and the government uses that tax dollars to help out the citizens. Clearly, that's not happening. So what's going on with the money?
Ayman Ahmed is not the only one. Los Angeles has 41,290 homeless people. California boasts the world's fifth largest economy in terms of GDP, but it is also one of the U.S. states with the most poor people. It was American recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Pearl Buck, who wrote, "The test of a civilization is the way that it cares for its helpless members." In the meantime, 3% of Americans could be facing eviction when the CDC's moratorium expires.
Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. Walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. As July 4th approaches and we're concerned about bridging gaps between red and blue states, there's also a huge difference in public views on American foreign policy. In one of our previous analysis segments, Professor Gordon Adam discussed the divide at length while talking to Saliha Farouk. Let's take a look.
Thank you and much appreciated. Today, we're very happy to be joined by Dr. Gordon Adams, who is a professor emeritus of the United States Foreign Policy, as well as from the American University in Washington. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute in Washington. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Gordon.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. I wanted to first start off by asking you that since the Trump presidency, which has perhaps changed the way many people might regard U.S. federal leadership when it comes to events abroad, Republicans are feeling a little bit less certain about the country's national interests in other countries. Talk to us about this potential shift in thinking regarding events abroad as they relate to foreign policy.
Well, there's been a very interesting shift in the last 4 years, partly through the Trump presidency. He's probably the first president that the United States has had in a long time whose general view of foreign policy was very, very nationalistic, very America first, very opposed to multilateral cooperation, very uncertain about remaining in alliances, very unwelcoming of U.S. military forces applied abroad, prepared to withdraw forces from countries in the region, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. So you had, while he was a very idiosyncratic and unpredictable president, he was also somebody who broadened the scope of the discussion of foreign policy in the United States to include talking about a different kind of U.S. presence overseas, a different set of alliance relationships, a withdrawal from cooperation. It was a most unusual presidency in that regard. And what has happened now is that because Donald Trump continues to have an influence on the Republican Party in the United States, the Republican Party has begun to adopt some, not all, of the precepts that seem to become clear through the years of the Trump presidency about not cooperating with allies, emphasizing U.S. military strength, U.S. Unilateralism, cooperation, even intimacy with Russia, areas of foreign policy which were most unexpected. So we now have a rather deep split, I would say, between the most Republican voters and most Democratic Party voters with respect to what are the important issues and how should the United States engage the world.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about multilateralism. Given the United States' divide on governments' multilateral priorities, to what extent do you believe that public opinion might affect the outcome of decisions made when it comes to the direction of foreign policy?
Here's the thing about foreign policy and American elections. The Americans are a rather insular population. They don't focus a lot of time and attention on things that are happening overseas, which means most American elections don't turn on foreign policy issues. It's the rare election that does. Those come second. Vietnam may be said to have had an impact on the 1968 presidential election between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. 1980, maybe, when Ronald Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter, who was running for his second term. But what is most compelling about foreign policy issues in American elections is not the policies themselves. Those rarely determine elections, but how the public views the reputation of the United States overseas and the capability of the person running for office to actually be a strong leader. Strong leadership is the one area which does seem to play an important role. John Kerry learned that in 2004 to his disadvantage, because the Republicans successfully pointed out that his service in Vietnam was uncertain and boastful and not what he claimed it to be. That suggested that he was a weak leader, not that Vietnam policy was wrong, but that he was potentially a weak leader. It was inaccurate, but it was effective, which often happens in American elections. So I don't see the Republican view right now as determining policy so much as it will lay a background for elections in terms of people seeing somebody as a symbol of strength. And that's the one thing that Donald Trump apparently conveyed, was that he was very strong. It doesn't follow what policies would happen, but that he was very strong.
Turning our attention a little bit about media portrayal. Now, when it comes to people falling into what's called a media bubble, to what extent are outside events or other critical points of view perhaps excluded from being able to help people make an informed decision about foreign policy decisions? And if you could tell us about the potential impact of this in American society.
Yes, you do find, and I think this is a new development in American politics, including domestic policy as well as foreign, and that is that this is now a very divided nation. And it's not only divided because people have different points of view, but it's divided because the media are now divided themselves. There was an interesting Pew poll last month that basically said Republicans tend to follow things like Fox News, radio commentators like the late Rush Limbaugh. The Democrats tend to follow sources like the network television, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times. These sources tend to be sources that are read by people to the left of the political spectrum. What that means is we're really seeing now dispensed two completely divergent views of America in the world, American foreign policy, also domestic policy. And there is no balance in those views on either side, really. CNN and the New York Times, I would argue, retain a certain amount of balance. But even there's been increasing reluctance to display what is sometimes called fake news from the right of the American media spectrum. So now the big media sources are competing with each other and focusing on their audience, not on a general audience. I come from the generation that used to watch the evening news, which was pretty fair, balanced stuff. I find myself almost incapable of consuming what's on television today and among those sources, because you're no longer viewing news, you're viewing opinion. What that means, I think, is it tends to drive the Americans in a more insular direction. The left views the world with important issues like climate change and pandemics and international cooperation as being an important place for the United States. The right tends to view things like military strength and anti-immigration as driving their views of the foreign policy of the United States, and they don't talk to each other. And the media don't talk to each other either. So what you're seeing is this polarization of the American media spectrum, which only reinforces the polarization in American society and American politics. It's not educating the American people anymore, it's dividing them.
Now, you mentioned the recent Pew poll that came out. In your professional opinion in general, what kind of social or perhaps economic factors might lead American audiences to regard government foreign policy focus areas in either one direction or another? I know that you touched a little bit about those factors, but in a more generalized sense.
The audiences that watch these different sets of media, some very right and some middle to left, are very different people as well. And this, the Pew poll did not focus on so much. It would have been interesting if they had. It would have been interesting to see what the ethnic diversity breakdown was of the people that they polled amongst the Republicans and amongst the Democrats. I rather suspect, but I haven't seen their raw data, so I don't know if they collected it. I rather suspect that the Republicans tended to be older, more male and white, and the Democrats tended to be younger, more ethnically mixed, and more representative of the gender distribution of American society. Pew didn't offer us how those differences in ethnicity and sociological standing and economic standing affect the views that are there. But other polling suggests that by and large, the older the voter is, the more they are white, the more they are male, and the less they have a college education, the more they are likely to take views that emphasize military strength, follow the leader, strong men, a view of the world that is very, if you will, Hobbesian. And the audience that views these media on the center to the left of the political spectrum tend to favor international cooperation, tend to favor working with allies, tend to favor the view that we can't really solve a lot of the world's problems through military force or by the US alone, tend to focus on things like climate change and health issues. In other words, they're more likely to be on that end of the policy spectrum as well. Geographically, that just divides the country basically in most states. You have states that tend to be CNN, New York Times, MSNBC viewers, and you have states, principally South, Midwest, who tend to be Fox News, Rush Limbaugh viewers. And they are divided from each other. And what's critical here is that there's no arena, because the parties now in Washington reflect that division. There's no arena in which those can be compromised.
Thank you for that insight. Now, the same Pew Research recently revealed that the majority of Americans are feeling a little bit more confident in Biden's handling as his foreign policy term begins. Now, especially in this fragile transitional period for American leadership, what do you make of that?
That is a little bit too early to tell. Biden hasn't yet encountered the kind of pushback and problem that all presidents encounter. He has the huge advantage of being non-Trump. He is calm, he's collected, he thinks through policy issues, he gives his staff a lot of leeway. You don't see the kind of turmoil in Washington that we saw for 4 years under the Trump administration. All of that tends to convey to most American people, but again, media is divided here, the view that this is a steady hand at the till. And you can expect him to reason things through and to work problems through. The biggest issues for Biden, of course, are domestic policy issues. If his vaccine strategy succeeds, if the economy begins to return to normal, if employment begins to tick upwards, all of those are going to be more determinative of his foreign policy than anything else directly involved in foreign policy. There were two things in the Pew poll, however, that I found quite interesting. And that was the point where both the Fox, Rush Limbaugh viewers and the New York Times, CNN, and MSNBC viewers agreed. Quite interesting. One was on the importance of jobs, and that emphasizes what I talked about earlier. Everybody on both sides of the political spectrum places a very high priority on creating employment and restoring the health of the American economy. So if Biden succeeds, he stands the possibility of gaining support. The other thing they agreed on is somewhat more disturbing, and that is viewing China as the principal adversary or the enemy of the United States. On the far right, the watchers of Fox and radio broadcasters use the word enemy to describe China. And that's been reinforced, I think, sadly, by the Biden administration, because they too have portrayed China as the principal adversary of the United States, as the country that needs to be contained, as the country that needs to be dealt with, as the country around which we have to focus military planning. In other words, both sides have been kind of putting out a message that China is the focus of U.S. foreign policy and it's an adversarial relationship. That does not bode well for our relationship with China, nor for the understanding of the American people about the sophistication with which China approaches the world. But it is now confrontational and, interestingly enough, on both sides of the political spectrum.
Dr. Gordon Adams, Professor Emeritus of United States Foreign Policy at the American University in Washington, as well as non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute in Washington, in light of the new Pew Research report. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Gordon.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Back to Hena Zuberi in the news studio.
Thank you, Saleha. Before moving on to our next analysis, Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. Earlier tonight, we shared the news of the ruling of the Supreme Court on Arizona's voting restrictions. To discuss the details of the Arizona voting bill, Professor Brooks Simpson, who is an American political history professor from Arizona State University, is joining Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid for a detailed conversation. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Hena. Miami tragedy continues every day with hope that some good news will come out. But lately, just one more person not alive came out. What is going on? Why it happened? And how more lives could be saved? To discuss with us, a person who is a forensic structural engineer himself, and he's president of SEP Engineers. Welcome, Joel Villans.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So tell us, Joel, why it is taking so long to rescue people?
That's a great question, and I'm sure it's a question that's on everyone's mind. So when a building collapses, such as this one here, you have what is essentially a second structure that forms at the base of the collapse. So the debris is actually another structure. So when those guys are out there trying to save lives, they also have to be really careful that when they remove the debris, they remove it in such a way that minimizes any shifting or displacement of the debris itself.
So what about those huge cranes which we see on construction sites? If they are installed on all the site and things are lifted gently from above, because there are so many people who are still buried there, and I hope they're alive.
I hope so as well. And yes, I think there are a couple of cranes there now. One of the challenges with removing larger pieces of debris is when you remove a larger piece, there is a greater chance of shifting or displacing of that debris. So I'm sure that they're working as quickly as possible, but also don't want to jeopardize or worsen the situation by causing a shift in the debris that exists there right now.
So, what you being a structural engineer and at the top of his forensic, what are the chances that people somehow, somewhere are still alive?
There's always hope. When a structure collapses in and of itself, as this one did, if you look at the video, there was a fairly vertical collapse. The columns sort of intersect themselves between the slabs. So there are some areas where there could potentially be what we call the air gaps between the debris. So there is still hope. At least I'm hopeful that we will find more survivors. But there is always a chance that there could be air gaps in that debris, and that there could still potentially be lives within those air gaps.
And that probably is the reason they are so careful that not lifting debris in a way that it disbalance and another collapse type situation might come, right?
Correct. If correct, essentially, when you're removing the debris, you want to make sure that if there are those air gaps there, that you don't close them off or you don't displace them while you're trying to remove the debris from off the site.
So from it, we are seeing the news items that it was already known that it has structural problems. Isn't there a code when some engineer determines it has a structural problem that you evacuate the whole thing and fix it first?
It's a little more complicated with condominiums. That there is a 2018 report out there that identified structural issues with the building, particularly of concern in the pool deck area, which also known as the pool podium. It's a little more complex because in a condominium you have the unit owners and you have a board, and the board is part of the association, and that association essentially controls the finances for the building. So in other words, if there's maintenance that needs to be performed, the board will determine how much of that maintenance is, and they would go back to the unit owners and say, okay, the maintenance is X, which means that every residence will be assessed a fee of Y to be able to make these repairs. And of course, if those budgets are either insufficient, or if the condo owners decide, in some cases, they waive those assessments, then obviously some of that maintenance potentially could get deferred or delayed. So we wish it were we wish it were simple, but with a condominium, there's an association, there's budgets, there's assessments, etc.
So that is sort of internal bureaucracy which delayed that. But report is of 2018. Wasn't that report provided to state of Florida that or the city or the county that this thing has such a major problems?
So when there's a site visit or when there's an investigation, the association will typically hire the engineer directly, and the engineer will supply a report to the association. That's their client. I'm not certain if that report would have made its way into the hands of some of the public agencies or not. Certainly, if there's repair work that's ongoing, there's a permit that gets pulled with the building department, and at that point they would be aware that there's repairs that are being done there. But as far as the report, typically that report gets submitted to the client, and what the client chooses to do with that report is really up to the client.
So building as large as it is, don't you think it should have some type of city or county process of inspection once in a while?
So that's a great question. So there are procedures in place in Miami-Dade County specifically for what is called a 40 years recertification. So essentially, when a building reaches 40 years in age, the county requires that the building undergo a review of the structural elements as well as the electrical components to make sure that there aren't any deficiencies that would cause a life safety issue. And that's typically done again at the 40-year mark of a structure in Miami-Dade County.
Is 40-year structure in these type of buildings, is 40 years some type of a life cycle point? How they determine 40 years? Why not 30 or 50?
It's another good question. So it is based on life cycle, and in certain cases, some engineers, some of us have argued that the life cycle of, say, a structure in the center of the state versus a structure that's in a coastal region would be potentially reduced because the exposure is greater. In other words, if I live in Orlando, Florida versus Miami Beach, in Orlando, Florida, I still get hurricanes, but I don't get as much of the salt spray and the exposure from the ocean in that property versus if I live in Miami Beach, there's a constant exposure to those elements and to that coastal zone.
So do your hypothesis says some of those elements played a role on this building?
We don't want to speculate, but in forensics, there's many contributing factors, and we try to start with many theories and then narrow them down. I would suspect that will be one of the contributing factors that the forensic engineers and the experts that are looking through all of this information will consider. That will definitely be a part of it. Whether it's the sole cause of it is yet to be determined, of course.
You're right now in that area. Are you working on that building?
I am in that area. I am here to meet with a couple of other colleagues that are working in that building. I have not specifically been inside the ground zero area yet. I just arrived here earlier this morning.
So as a forensic engineer, what will be the specific things which you'll be looking for?
Another great question. So forensics is a process just like everything else. Right now, the debris is very important. The positioning of that debris is very important because the debris will tell a story. So as it's being removed, I'm sure that it's also being documented for analysis at a later date. So I would be looking for that. I would also be looking at the vertical face of the structure where the building dismembered from the other tower, and I would be looking for clues there. And lastly, I would be looking at the condition of the materials in the debris. In other words, is the concrete severely worn? Is the reinforcing severely corroded? Of course, if a building collapses, the reinforcing is not going to corrode overnight. So I would be looking for those types of clues to kind of give me an idea of what could potentially be going on or what happened.
Well, thank you so much for your time. At the end, tell me, this forensic, is it a big field in which a lot of people are getting in?
It's not a very big field. There aren't that many of us. There are enough of us, I think. Obviously, when something like this happens, we always wish we had more forensic engineers, but it's a somewhat specialized area. Most structural engineers practice design and inspections. A very few of us get into the forensics area. I guess some of us are even more curious than design. So,
well, thank you so much, Joel Valens, a forensic structural engineer who is right now in the Miami area, president of SCP Engineer. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Back to you, Hena.
Thank you so much. That's all from our Washington studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube channel or Facebook page. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Assalamu alaikum and good night.